He does everything right. He tells the truth, keeps his promises, refuses to play dirty, and then watches a colder, more ruthless man take everything from him. Why does that story keep repeating, from Renaissance courts to boardrooms to your own relationships? Because Niccolo Machiavelli saw something most moral people still refuse to admit. Good intentions by themselves are politically useless. But first, let me tell you why this matters more today than ever. Florence, early 16th century. The city is brilliant, unstable, beautiful, and vicious. Cathedrals rise over streets filled with merchants, mercenaries, priests, spies, and ambitious men who smile in public and scheme in private. Power changes hands fast. Loyalty is rented. Virtue is performed. In this world, Niccolo Machiavelli is not writing abstract philosophy from a quiet study. He is a diplomat, a servant of the Florentine Republic, a man who has watched states collapse because their leaders confused moral appearance with political reality. Then his world falls apart. The Medici return to power. Machiavelli is dismissed, accused of conspiracy, arrested, tortured, and exiled. Imagine that for a second. A man who devoted himself to statecraft is suddenly stripped of office, reputation, and influence. At night, isolated in the countryside, he puts on formal clothes, as if still preparing to enter a court that no longer wants him, and writes the book that would make his name immortal, the Prince Asterisk. And what he wrote next changed everything. Not because he invented cruelty. Cruel men existed long before Machiavelli. Not because he hated morality. That's too simple. What made the Prince Asterisk dangerous was that it tore away the comforting illusion that politics rewards goodness. It doesn't. Politics rewards effectiveness. That sentence alone is enough to make people uneasy, because it clashes with how we want the world to work. We want to believe that if your motives are pure, your outcomes will be too. We want to believe decent people naturally rise. We want to believe human nature is fair. But history is not a reward system. It is a pressure test. And here's the open loop that runs through this entire essay. Machiavelli was not just explaining princes. He was explaining why so many well-meaning people fail in every era, including ours. Because in the language of dark psychology, the person with the better intentions is often at a disadvantage against the person with the clearer strategy. And unless you understand that, you don't become virtuous. You become vulnerable. Machiavelli's first brutal insight comes disguised as advice, but it lands like a warning, a prince who wishes to maintain his state must learn how not to be good. Most people hear that and think Machiavelli is advocating evil. But slow down. He's saying something colder and more psychologically accurate. He's saying that goodness, when treated as an absolute rule in a world full of deception, becomes a liability. If everyone around you lies, manipulates, flatters, withholds, signals virtue, and strikes only when the moment is safe, then your rigid commitment to being good simply makes you predictable. And predictable people are easy to defeat. This is where the Prince Asterisk intersects with dark psychology and modern psychology in a way many self-improvement channels still avoid. Human beings do not merely respond to morality. They respond to incentives, fear, status, appearances, tribal loyalties, and perceived strength. That doesn't make people monsters. It makes them human. Here's where most people get it wrong. They think manipulation only looks like obvious villainy. It usually doesn't. It looks like charm. It looks like moral language. It looks like someone saying all the right things while quietly pursuing power. Isn't that one of the oldest patterns in human nature? Machiavelli understood that leaders fail when they mistake the world as it should be for the world as it is. In a sentence often paraphrased from his work, he warns that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. That is not cynicism for its own sake. That is strategic realism. And yes, this is where his thinking collides with Stoic philosophy in a fascinating way. Stoicism teaches you to govern yourself, to master impulse, fear, vanity, and emotional chaos. Machiavelli teaches you to read the external world without illusion. One is inner discipline, the other is outer strategy. Ancient wisdom often becomes powerful when these two are combined. Without Stoic philosophy, Machiavellian realism can turn you hard, paranoid, and morally hollow. But without Machiavellian realism, modern Stoicism can become naive, calm on the surface, but blind to predatory behavior. That's the pattern break, because maybe the real self-improvement lesson here isn't be nicer. Maybe it's see clearly. Think about your own life. The employee who works hardest but never learns office politics. The friend who keeps giving second chances to someone who interprets kindness as weakness. The leader who avoids difficult decisions because they don't want to be disliked. These people aren't failing because they lack virtue. They're failing because they assume virtue explains the game. But there's something even more shocking. Machiavelli believed people often prefer the appearance of goodness to goodness itself. Now we get to one of Machiavelli's most famous and disturbing observations. Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, because everyone can see, but few can feel. In other words, most people judge appearances. They react to symbols, gestures, confidence, ceremony, reputation, and timing long before they understand substance. This is not just political advice from a dead Florentine. This is social reality. Public life runs on optics. Careers rise on perception. Entire institutions survive because they look stable long after they've become fragile. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good, it should. Because one of the hardest truths in philosophy and psychology is that sincerity does not guarantee influence. Competence does not guarantee recognition. Good intentions do not guarantee trust. Often, the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. Controversial statement, here it is. In many situations, being morally pure matters less than being strategically legible. A lot of people will hate that sentence. They'll hear it as permission to become fake. It's not. It's a warning that if you refuse to understand appearances, appearances will rule you anyway. If you communicate poorly, if you signal weakness at the wrong moment, if you act with private integrity but public confusion, someone more polished and less scrupulous will define you before you define yourself. This is where it gets interesting. Machiavelli does not simply say, be feared, be deceptive, win at all costs. That caricature misses the deeper point. He is trying to train perception. He is forcing you to confront the gap between your intention and your effect. You may intend kindness and create dependency. You may intend fairness and create chaos. You may intend honesty and reveal information that arms your enemy. The mature question is not, was my heart pure? The mature question is, what did my action actually produce? That shift alone can transform your life. In modern Stoicism, people talk about focusing on what you can control. Good. But control is not just emotional regulation. It's strategic self-command. It's controlling your reactions, your timing, your disclosures, your public image, your boundaries. It's knowing when silence protects more than explanation. Have you noticed how often weak boundaries disguise themselves as compassion? How often conflict avoidance pretends to be maturity? How often people call themselves too nice when they really mean they are afraid to impose consequences? That is pure Machiavelli territory. And no, this does not mean you should become cruel. It means you should stop assuming everyone else is governed by the same conscience you are. Dark psychology begins where projection ends. The moment you realize another person can use guilt, charm, pity, outrage, or moral language as tools, not expressions of truth, you stop being easy to control. Your transformation begins when you understand this. Goodness without discernment is not virtue. It is exposure. Now we arrive at the line everyone remembers, even if they know nothing else about the prince ***. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This is the sentence that made Machiavelli notorious. But once again, people flatten it into cartoon villain logic. He is not saying love has no value. He is saying love is unstable when it depends on gratitude, emotion, or convenience. Fear, specifically fear of consequences, is often more reliable. Why? Because affection changes with circumstance. Incentives do not. Think about the modern versions of this. A parent who wants to be loved, so they never enforce rules. A manager who wants harmony, so poor performance goes unpunished. A leader who mistakes popularity for authority. At first, they appear compassionate. In reality, they produce disorder. And eventually, the people they wanted approval from lose respect for them anyway. That is Machiavelli's cruel brilliance. He sees that softness in the wrong place can become a form of negligence. And here's the rhetorical question that should haunt you. If your refusal to use necessary hardness leads to greater harm, are you still morally innocent? This is where his philosophy becomes more than political advice. It becomes a theory of responsibility. Sometimes the person who insists on staying personally clean is simply outsourcing the cost of their weakness to everyone else. They won't fire the destructive employee. They won't confront the manipulator. They won't end the toxic relationship. They won't draw the line. And then they call the resulting collapse unfortunate, as if it came from nowhere. Machiavelli would say it did not come from nowhere. It came from your sentimental refusal to see human nature clearly. Now connect the three insights. First, you must learn how not to be good, not because evil is noble, but because rigid goodness in a corrupt environment gets exploited. Second, people judge by appearances, so if you don't manage perception, you surrender power to those who do. Third, fear can be more reliable than love, meaning consequences often preserve order better than goodwill alone. Together, these form Machiavelli's real message. Effective leadership requires the courage to act against your image of yourself, to stop worshipping your intentions, to stop assuming the world will reward your purity, to become responsible not for how good you feel, but for what your decisions cause. And here is the emotional peak, the part most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What if your biggest weakness is not that you're too moral, but that you are attached to feeling moral? What if your kindness is partly vanity? What if your honesty is sometimes impulsive self-expression disguised as principle? What if your refusal to confront is not peace, but fear dressed in soft language? That is why the prince still matters. Not because it teaches you to dominate others, because it exposes the hidden ego inside goodness. The part of you that wants to remain innocent even when innocence is no longer responsible. This is not anti-philosophy. It is philosophy stripped of anesthesia. Ancient wisdom usually comforts us by telling us who we should be. Machiavelli unsettles us by showing what human nature does under pressure. And if you can hold both truths, Stoic self-mastery within, Machiavellian clarity without, you become far harder to manipulate, far harder to deceive, and far less likely to fail for noble reasons. Go back to the opening image, the decent man who loses everything because he refuses to play dirty. The easy conclusion is that he was too good for the world. Machiavelli would force a harsher conclusion. Maybe he wasn't too good. Maybe he was too unprepared. There's a difference. Being ethical is not the same as being helpless. Being compassionate is not the same as being porous. Being principled is not the same as being strategically blind. Real strength is the ability to preserve your values without advertising your vulnerabilities to people who have none. So here's the challenge. For the next 7 days, notice every moment when you justify an action by calling it kindness. Notice every time you avoid a hard conversation because you'd rather be seen as good than be effective. Notice every time you explain yourself to someone who has already shown they will weaponize your honesty. Then ask one brutal question at the end of each day. ***, did my behavior create clarity or did it invite exploitation? ***. This is how philosophy becomes practical. This is where dark psychology stops being content and becomes defense. This is where self-improvement stops being affirmation and becomes discipline. Not the discipline to suppress your humanity, but the discipline to stop letting your good intentions make decisions your wisdom should be making. And yes, some people will hear this and say it's too cold, too harsh, too cynical. Let them. The world has already been shaped by people who understand power better than the people who moralize about it. If decent people refuse to learn that lesson, they do not purify the world. They abandon it to the ruthless. So drop your interpretation in the comments. Is Machiavelli exposing a dark truth about human nature or creating the very cynicism he describes? The best answers always come from this community. And if this shifted something in the way you see power, motive, and your own behavior, remember the real lesson of the prince ***. Intentions do not protect you. Perception, consequence, and clarity do. Goodness without strength is just surrender.